Hello everyone, today I'm looking at Soul Reaver 2, a Legacy of Kain series game. So this one was, it was alright, I guess. Just the naming conventions of these games are very, very funny. I believe it started with Blood Omen, and then they made Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, and Blood Omen was about Kain, and Soul Reaver play as Raziel. And then after that, they made Soul Reaver 2, a Legacy of Kain series. And then after that, they made Blood Omens 2, featuring only Kain. And then they had Legacy of Kain Defiance, where you play both as Raziel and Kain. And then you have Legacy of Kain Dark Sun, which never came out, it was cancelled, along with Nosgoth, their multiplayer. Anyway, there's a whole, lush, rich history of misleading titles in this series. But Soul Reaver 2 is specifically tied to the previous game, Soul Reaver 1, as I'll call it. The biggest, I guess, issue for me for this game is that it's very short and it's very linear, which aren't necessarily bad things, but and this is something that's funny because I've always said, I do appreciate shorter games, more concise experiences, things that you just play for a few hours. The only issue with this game is actually the same issue with Soul Reaver 1, is that it ends on a cliffhanger. And the first game ends on a real cliffhanger. This one, it just ends. There's no conclusion. It's literally, we're in the middle of the story, and it's like, yep, that's it, roll credits, because time is a paradox. It certainly is when you can't figure out how to finish your story. That being said, the voice acting and the writing and the dialogue in this game is still absolutely some of the best I've ever heard, like down, hands down. And it's funny because Amy Hennig is kind of the main person credited for story production, writing, like it's really her stuff. And she went off to make the Uncharted series, I believe. So it's really interesting to see her influence and to go from these characters to very, I would say, normal-ish characters. But again, her writing style it's phenomenal. It's really amazing, very well done, very just there's a lot of moments in both these games, well actually sorry, in mostly in Soul Reaver 2, where Raziel will have a lot of what do you call it, an aside or a self-narrative dialogue where he's describing what he's doing, what he's seeing, what he's experiencing. And it's funny because I can think of other games where that happens and I absolutely hate it, like Dead Space 2, where Isaac is just, well, he's audibly commenting on everything that's happening, while rather here Raziel's in his head and is just narrating what he's feeling, what he's going through, and what he's experiencing as he goes through the story. The other thing that is really interesting too about this game is that, unlike the first game, there are no collectibles. There are still power-ups, but they're part of a linear system of progression of going from one dungeon or area to the next. And all the upgrades are basically your Soul Reaver gets a new elemental power it can possess, and it essentially also powers up your health as well. I guess another thing that's interesting about this game is that the way it's designed is that, I guess the way they were thinking about these games back in the day was that you basically keep all of the upgrades from the previous game, besides the special power-ups you would find. So Raziel doesn't learn how to swim or climb walls or shoot little orbs. So he keeps all of his upgrades from the last game and just brings them forward to this one. So I think it'd be interesting if they kept making these games and kept on going as little installments of story and powers. It's an interesting perspective to take and is much more aligned with the whole DLC, online content kind of releases, where you don't have to finish the whole story in one go. You're able to just to have one little contained section that isn't finished, but it'll go to the next one. Some things I'd cite would be Life is Strange. I guess you could say Mass Effect DLC and other kinds of DLCs that kind of just add on to the same experience. From a gameplay perspective, it's actually more similar, I'd say, to something like Devil May Cry, where those wrap up their whole complete holistic stories. But from a gameplay design standpoint, if you look at simply the Devil May Cry series as just games without any story, you can see that it's pretty much just an importing, remixing, and introduction of new mechanics. Of course, yes, once you start each game, you have to relearn them or buy them using the Red Orb system. But it's pretty much just building on the same basic mechanics and interactions you've had in all the previous series and updating them to some degree. And in this game, that's pretty much the exact same concept, and the baseline concept for pretty much every game is like, why would you ever take away features? And that's kind of an interesting issue and argument to have, because some games, if you were to think of Halo multiplayer games, sometimes you restrict certain features and you actually get better results. I mean, Halo itself was the first to implement a 2-weapon system, which was at that point unheard of. It's like, why would you only have 2 weapons when like things like Call of Duty or Duke Nukem or Doom, you can just hold all the weapons at once. The whole point is that it was encouraging players to pick up new weapons constantly and to experiment with them. But anyway, I digress. That's a completely separate issue. But Soul Reaver, another really big change they did in terms of gameplay is that the Soul Reaver was kind of like a combat enhancement, where that you only had it when you were at full health. While in this one, you can tell they're very much leaning a lot more heavily into the combat aspect. For example, I mean, just from a simple gameplay perspective, everything is a lot smoother. Raziel moves smoother. The enemy animations look smoother. Even the designs of the textures now, the jump from only a few years back in those days, you can see Raziel's textures are a lot more clean. And in some ways, I don't like that. For example, the fact that Raziel's scarf has a very clear pattern on it is something I didn't like, because the implication I got from the very first game was that Raziel's scarf, even though it had a design and a pattern on it, it was tattered, it was intentionally gritty and kind of destroyed and bad looking. But in this one, it's all kind of freshly textured and cleaned up, and it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, whatever, I guess. I mean, you can see the model better, but the kind of aberrations and discrepancies you would find due to hardware limitations in the first game gave it a certain style and feeling. And that's kind of the thing, or the impression I got from other people's reviews of this game before playing it, is that they said, yeah, this one's good, but it's not as good as the first Soul Reaver. It has a sense of... the first game just had a sense of atmosphere. And I think another thing that really kind of took Soul Reaver 2 a step back was the sound design. And there are good and bad parts here. But from the OST perspective, the soundtrack in Soul Reaver 1, maybe because of the limitations or the design, it has a very distinct soundtrack. It has very weird noises and sounds. Sometimes you hear like yells in the middle of the soundtrack. It was very distinct. While this one, it feels a little bit more generic fantasy, generic adventure. So yeah, that's the only thing that kind of not as great. However, I will say, in terms of sound effects and sound design, this game does some stuff that really made me raise my eyebrows. Raziel stepping into shallow pools of water make this very distinct water plopping sound. Raziel walking over a drawbridge, you get the most crisp wooden footsteps I have ever heard, that I was kind of shocked when I was listening to it. I'm like, what is this? Why are these sound effects so wet and fresh and ready to go? I don't know how else to say it. Aside from that, graphically, Soul Reaver 2 looks very nice. Again, it kind of is starting to look like how every other game of that era is starting to look. The other thing, too, is that the cutscenes seem to drag on a little bit longer than they should have, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes you'd get a full conversation of dialogue that was always very well done. I mean, not only the voice acting, but again, I have to give it to the writing for the dialogue of Raziel, the way he describes how he feels. And the story itself, too, is rather interesting because in the original, when it was a very simple revenge story, you just want to kill Cain. It was a very simple, kind of macho story where you're just on a revenge quest. And this one, it's a little bit more nuanced because now you have, the old one, voiced by Tony Jay, you have Cain, and you have Mobius, and each one of you is kind of motivating you and telling you where to go and what to do, and essentially using as a pawn in their game. And so Raziel, he's always confronting them, trying to figure out who he has to fight, who's lying to him, and who he can trust. And he's basically antagonistic to everyone. And throughout the game, it's kind of an interesting character development where Raziel kind of develops his own sense of will and self, where he confronts, the old one's like, I made you, Raziel, and I can unmake you. And he's like, yeah, whatever, Dad. I mean, that's pretty much the subtext is like, don't tell me what to do, Dad. I'm going to be a Soul Reaver of my own making, kind of thing. And so the new thing in this game is there's a time system. So I can say it's a system, but really it's very linear, where you warp to different time zones and different time frames. So you basically have the present, the future, and the past of about a difference of 500 years. And the only difference there is that you just go there for different story beats and paces. And that's the other thing about Soul Reaver 2. It's very, very linear, i.e. you can't really go back. Once you go to a new time zone, a new time era, you can pretty much not return to the previous one. So that's what I mean. It's a very linear, story-driven game, but it's still with a major gameplay focus, which is, again, just interesting because it's such a departure in terms of design from the very first Soul Reaver. They really just kind of threw out a lot of stuff but added a lot of stuff. Again, another thing that they added is R2 now, thank God, is a first-person view that only shoots projectiles when you're in that mode, which is a lot more intuitive than pressing L2 and R2 at the same time. Now L1 is the one that does blocking. So like I said, there's a much larger emphasis on combat, and sometimes it can be very frustrating. You still have the dodge mechanics here. Again, the biggest issue, or the biggest change rather, is with the Soul Reaver, and the issue with that is that instead of being a weapon you get at full health, you can always bring it out now. But the issue is that if it attacks someone, the more it attacks someone, the more damage it gets, the more you use it. And when you destroy or kill something, it'll absorb that soul and it won't go to your health, and it'll increase the power of the Soul Reaver. The only issue is of course you're not healing because all of the souls are being absorbed by the Reaver. And the second thing is that as the blade goes stronger, if it gets to maximum health, maximum damage rather, it'll actually start draining your health a little bit. So it's an interesting trade-off system, and I found it to be a little bit frustrating at times, to be honest. The other cool thing that they do more so in this game is that when you go to the spirit realm, if you're fighting demons, the demons join you in the spirit realm. Because in the first game, there was really never a feeling of, how shall I say? There was never a feeling of danger, really, of losing progress. Because I mean there are many checkpoints throughout this game as well, decently spaced apart, but whenever you went to the spirit realm in Soul Reaver 1, there was no concern or fear that you were actually going to die, because the enemies there were always so weak that it was just more of a nuisance and a frustration to kill them, to get to the point where you could come back into the real world and continue playing the game. I guess another mechanic that is gone from this game is resurrection. Once you kill an enemy, they kind of stay dead. And what's interesting is that what they've introduced in this game as the main enemy type you fight as cannon fodder are humans. So you have seraphim warriors who are basically human warriors who come after you and fight you. And what it really is cool is that each, of course, character type has a different death animation. So they're still skewering these. There's decapitations, but now you can actually see like the blood and stuff. So this game is definitely an M-rated game for the time, because it does not mess around with gore or anything of that nature. Definitely M-rated style. Again, it's very interesting with the dialogue and the fact that even Cain is trying to... It turns out Cain's basically telling you the truth, that you want to find your destiny, but it's going to undo you, basically. The big twist, spoilers in this one, is that Raziel is the servant of his own demise or destruction, which is essentially that he ends up going back in time and killing his seraphim human self. So he's the very one who did that, and then Cain resurrects him later. And again, it's a weird thing, because you're like, okay, well, if that worked, and how would Raziel then change fate and history? And there's a whole bunch of time. Like, whenever a media introduces time travel, it's always very messy, where the things you do in the past were supposed to happen, and now, of course, he's the creator of his own demise kind of thing. Aside from that, you get to see a bit more of the vampires, the vampire world. Again, the world itself isn't that huge. There's basically like 10 zones, basically. There's the main Seraphim Cathedral area. There's a swamp, just terrible. There's a bunch of caverns. What I found most challenging in this game was actually just basic navigation. Maybe it was my TV or the game, I don't know, but there are some parts in this game that are just seriously very, very dark. Darker than Soul Reaver 1, to the point where I can't see, and there's not really brightness settings on the game, and my TV remote is kind of dead, so I just had to deal with it. But there were some points where the only possible way to move forward was to go into the spirit world and give everything a slightly blue hue so I can actually see where I'm going. And the worst of that was definitely the caverns, where you have to swim through these caverns and to figure out where to go. And thank God that they have these, light stones or whatever, these chunks of rock that glow as markers, because otherwise it would be pretty much impossible. The other thing that I also get from Soul Reaver 2 is that I used a lot of brain power in this one. I know that's a weird thing to say, but sometimes it was just very difficult to tell where to go and what to do and how to do the puzzle. And I think I looked at a guide maybe once, but I kind of thought to myself, this seems like it shouldn't be this complicated. For example, there was one puzzle room I was in, and I was trying to figure out, and I do love the puzzles in this game, but I was trying to figure out, okay, I've activated this switch, I've activated that switch. What do I do now? I need to get up to this point, but I can't. And it turns out the solution was to basically go to the spirit realm. And when you go to the spirit realm, these columns would extend and you could climb up on them. And it's like, how would I know that? How would I know how to do that? There's no sign or indicator that would be possible. And out of all the pillars and other wall decorations of the room, these are the ones that move forward. It's very frustrating. The second most frustrating thing was there was another puzzle where this really got me, where you have these obelisks that are in this room, and it's a light puzzle, and there are like 4 obelisks in the room, but one of them you can actually pull, and it's very poorly choreographed or signaled that you can move this giant structure and that you should even try to move this giant structure, because there's no real hints there that you can or should do that. And that's the one time I looked up the guide. I was like, I've been in this room, I've tried everything, I have no idea. As it turns out, you can grab these giant pillars and pull them. And thinking about it, there weren't a lot of other pulling puzzles or grabbing like cubes puzzles in this game. There were way more in Soul Reaver 1, but again, this one is very linear, more combat focused. And yeah. Oh, the other thing they added to this game I forgot is they added a map system, and it's pretty bare bones, but it actually kind of works. For example, when I was in the swamp or in the caverns and it was very dark and hard to see, I was very appreciative that the map, as simple as it is, would basically show you where you had to go next. It had a red dot on it, and along with it, you had a compass. And it's one of the few games where I actually did use the compass. I'm like, okay, I'm somewhere in this swamp. I'm really stuck. And the whole swamp, by the way, it's a giant like looping area, or like oscillating. It's a bunch of corridors or wide open spaces, but on the map it's just one giant chunk. So you really have to figure out exactly where you have to go north and then south and then west or east if you want to exit the level. But I actually did find myself using it quite a bit. It almost reminded me of the worst map I've ever used in any game ever, which is Prince of Persia Warrior Within, which highlights where you are, but you don't have any compass. Like, they expect you to basically memorize the map and be like, oh yeah, I have to go to the hanging dark gardens rather than the hanging light gardens or something. So yeah, so there's that. I also find it a little bit odd that, so in this game you have 4 elements. The 4 elements that you can power up your Soul Reaver with that do 4 different things. And guess what they are? And you might think, oh, air, earth, water, fire. But, the typical Greek style. No, and the order you get them in is darkness, light, air, and fire. Which is just very odd. Like, you'd think you would reserve light and darkness for the last bit, and darkness, all it does is it disables this one eye trap that basically one-shots you. Light, you can basically activate certain switches for it, and honestly the main use of the light one is that it creates a thing of light around you so you can actually see where I'm going. The amount of times I use the secondary aspect of that light beam, even if I was carrying another enemy's weapon, just so I could see the environment, was like most of the game. Then air, you activate certain, air streams that, blow you up. And for fire, it was really introduced very late at the end of the game. And so you just used it for certain doors, really. It didn't really do much else besides that. And it melted ice one time. So that's why I'm very, not concerned, but curious as to why this game got developed it got so far in development that it just feels like half the game or a third of the game. It feels even shorter than Soul Reaver 1. And like, they just introduced a new mechanic and they're like, yep, it's over. We're done. We're moving on. And it's such a weird feeling to do that. It feels like an installment series rather than an actual game. But at the same time, because the jumps in technology are so intense, it's really interesting to see Soul Reaver 1 and 2, just from a graphical standpoint. They're so different. Mechanically, everything there is so different. And it would be interesting, I think fun, if the Soul Reaver series was still going on today, because then you could look at the very first one and compare it to the very latest one, and they'd be so different, just as how most games between certain technologies and certain eras are just rebranded as completely new series because the gameplay change is so drastic and so different. It doesn't even resemble its previous ones at all. I guess the only one you could say is like Breath of the Wild. Zelda, Breath of the Wild compared to Ocarina or the original Zelda are just completely different games entirely. So, but yeah, I found that I was constantly having to hyper concentrate on this game, maybe because of the dark setting, maybe because of the lack of direction or clear puzzle cues. But I felt like I was really struggling with this game. As short as it was it felt very difficult. And the combat is not very forgiving either. It can be pretty challenging, but you can always get through it. Again, I think I'm not sure how to feel about this game. I'm glad I played it. It was interesting, but I just had way more loose ends and way more questions than answers. For example, Raziel and his creator squid god Cthulhu thing never gets resolved. They have beef and doesn't get resolved. Him and Mobius doesn't get resolved. The whole thing between him and the Seraphim and the other vampires that kind of gets elaborated on who his real identity is. And they did this in the last game where Raziel turns out he was a Seraphim, and then in this game it turns out he was a Seraphim who actually killed himself in a time warp thing. So I'm honestly kind of disappointed / angry that I've played this game and it gave me all these cool characters and settings, but did not resolve the issues. And so it's kind of a weird question where if you had to play the best game of all time, but it didn't conclude or wrap up any of its endings, would you actually want to play it? And the answer is kind of no. I'm really more angry at an incomplete story than at an incomplete game. I'd rather if they just wrapped up the story in some way and just made it work. But at the same time, if you're going to cut corners like that and just end the game at what feels like the halfway point, I wouldn't be happy with that either, I guess. I don't know. The feeling this game gave me was actually similar to Shenmue, because it feels like it's never gonna conclude. We're always teased this final fight with this ultimate villain, and it just never occurs. It never happens. We're just always baited with this epicness that just doesn't happen. And honestly, I'm very conflicted about this game. I'm kind of glad I played it, but I'm also kind of angry I did as well. And I have a feeling this is going to be my last game of the Soul Reaver series, or in the Legacy of Kain series. I'm too angry that it did not conclude on any meaningful end and just kept introducing more exclamations. I guess this is a test case for if you have a really good story but it's not finished, would you enjoy it? And my answer is absolutely not. I'm really upset that it just didn't conclude in any meaningful way. There wasn't a grand finishing element to it. Even from a gameplay perspective, it's not like we had some final level where we're using our light, dark, fire, wind powers and all of our skills. I mean, the combat ramped up near the end, but when it ended, I just thought, no, we were in the middle of this story. We were just getting started. And it just ends with time abhors a paradox, with the fact that Raziel decides to not die, and the ending was also very confusing, where the Soul Reaver was also Raziel's soul this whole time. And so because there's Raziel's soul resides within his spirit Soul Reaver and the actual Soul Reaver, that when he kills his human form in the time paradox, it creates a paradox, and then it starts consuming Raziel, and Kain stops it, but he says give into it. I'm honestly very confused. The one thing I couldn't say is that Mobius, even though he was introduced at the first game ending, he becomes a very good character at this game, and is kind of the overarching villain as it appears. But again, we don't get to confront him. We don't get to do anything. We get to do another installment, another chapter in this basically unfinished book. And I have a feeling that if I go on to play Defiance, it's going to be the same issue, and it's going to be with gameplay that is going to be very kind of, I think, outdated or standardized for that time period. So I'm very interested and motivated, and I enjoy the Soul Reaver universe. And I was very much interested in the Dark Sun project before it got canceled. I love the universe, I love the concept, but God, it's worse than a Stephen King novel. I need a conclusion. I need the hero to at least win. I need an ending theme or something. I need the story to conclude, even if it's a small chapter of it. And so, and I guess that's true. This game is a bunch of chapters, little nuanced pieces and whatever. But yeah, I very conflicted on this one. If you played the first game and you haven't played this one, you're not really missing much, is kind of the conclusion. Anyway, so yeah, this will be the end for my Soul Reaver whatever saga video, whatever franchise. It was interesting to get into, interesting to see why people like this and why they were so hardly baited like Shenmue fans. There's some of them are super diehard. They want to see the end of the story and just will never get it. And it remastered recently on I think PlayStation 4 and 5. So there obviously is some interest still in this series, but for how it stands now, I really can't really recommend this. If you've played the first game, just stick with the first game. Anyway, that's pretty much all I can really say about this. I'll see you later, guys. Bye.